The access logs on the secondary server did not align. I stared at the lines of hexadecimal code scrolling across my encrypted monitor, noting the 14-second discrepancy between the physical keycard swipe at the east stairwell and the network login on the executive floor. 14 seconds was an eternity in structural security. It meant someone had paused. It meant someone was hesitating. I tapped the space bar, freezing the security footage on screen 3. The timestamp read 1842. The camera angle was terrible, a fisheye lens distorted by the fluorescent glare of the Gregory Holdings corporate retreat. But the anomaly in the frame was clear. It wasn't a shadow or a glitch. It was her. Vivian Gregory sat on the edge of the mahogany credenza in the empty boardroom, sorting through stacks of quarterly projections. The world called her the CEO's ugly daughter. I had overheard the lobby guards whispering it yesterday, their voices carrying that specific cruelty reserved for women who did not fit the geometric standard of corporate aesthetics. A deep, sprawling port wine stain covered the right side of her face, a vivid, purplish-red map of pigmentation that stretched from her temple down across her cheek and jawline. To them, it was a deformity. To my eye, a mind cursed with an obsession for alignment and structural truth, it was simply a biological variable. What fascinated me was the asymmetry of her posture. She held a pen in her left hand, but the legal pad was angled for a right-handed writer. She was hiding her dominant side, physically curling inward to keep the marked side of her face angled away from the glass doors. She was the brain of this company, the shadow executive doing the math her father took credit for. Yet she engineered her physical existence to take up as little space as possible. A low vibration rattled my desk, I looked down at the encrypted tablet. A perimeter alert. Someone had bypassed the outer gate of the retreat. I stood up the chair, rolling silently backward. The discrepancy wasn't a glitch. The threat was already inside the building. The humidity outside the estate was suffocating a heavy Midwestern blanket that made the air feel like damp wool. I moved through the manicured courtyard, the gravel crunching softly beneath my boots. The main house sat at the top of a wide tier of stone steps. The sunset was bleeding a harsh, bruised orange across the horizon, casting long shadows. I found her at the base of the stairs. She wasn't alone. Marcus Thorne, the vice president of acquisitions, and Vivian's former fiancé, was standing too close to her. He had her cornered against the stone balustrade. The hostility in his posture was measurable. Shoulders, squared chin, dropped, invading her personal radius by a full 18 inches. I stopped walking. I could hear the sharp edge of his voice carrying over the sound of the wind in the pines. "You think the board is going to accept you?" Marcus sneered, tapping a thick manila folder against his palm. "I have the server receipts, Vivian. I have the emails. When I show them that your father's brilliant restructure was actually drafted by the ghost in the basement, he looks weak. And when I show them the private medical files you expensed through the company, you look unstable. You step down tomorrow, or this all goes to the press." Vivian's back was rigid. She wore a simple black short-sleeved top that contrasted sharply with the pale tension in her arms. She didn't shrink, but her right foot shifted backward, the heel of her shoe catching the uneven lip of the first stone step. She lost her center of gravity. Her ankle rolled outward with a sickening snap of sound, and she gasped, her knees buckling. Marcus didn't reach for her. He stepped back to avoid her falling against his suit. I covered the remaining distance in 3 strides. I didn't yell. I didn't announce myself. I simply stepped between them, placing my body as a physical barrier. I caught Vivian by the waist before she hit the stone, my left hand gripping her arm, steadying her. "Who the hell are you?" Marcus snapped, startled. I ignored him. I looked down at Vivian. Her face was pale, the port wine stains stark against the sudden loss of color in her skin. She was breathing fast, her fingers gripping the fabric of my plain gray t-shirt. Keeping my voice entirely flat, I asked, "Can you bear weight on the right leg?" She shook her head, her teeth gritted. No, I had twisted. Over my shoulder, I fixed Marcus with a rooted stance and kept my hands clear of my pockets. Step away from the stairs. I am an executive of this company. Marcus said, his face flushing. You're the new security auditor. You work for me. I am contracted by the board to assess physical and digital vulnerabilities. I corrected calmly. Right now, you are a physical vulnerability standing in an egress path. Move. Marcus opened his mouth, but the absolute lack of emotion in my tone stopped him. Bullies expected anger or fear. They did not know how to process a brick wall. He sneered, turning on his heel and walking back toward the driveway, the manila folder tight in his grip. I turned back to Vivian. The sun was dipping lower, catching the deep purple of her cheek. I need to move you off this elevation. I'm going to carry you up the stairs to the porch. You don't have to, she whispered, her voice tight with pain and residual humiliation. I can just sit here. Her gaze flicked once toward the driveway, where Marcus had disappeared, then back to me. She swallowed, gave one tight nod, and her fingers closed more firmly around my shirt. Okay, she said barely above a whisper. The stone is retaining 70 degrees of ambient heat, but the temperature will drop by 15 degrees in the next 20 minutes. You will go into mild shock, I stated. I bent down, sliding my right arm behind her knees and my left across her back, lifting her smoothly. She weighed less than I expected. She wrapped her arms around my neck instinctively to anchor herself. As I carried her up the wide stone steps, the fading sunlight washed over us. I kept my gaze focused on the heavy wooden doors of the estate. I could feel her looking at me. She rested her head slightly against my shoulder, a sudden heavy surrender to the pain in her ankle. She didn't hide her face. For the first time, she let the marked side of her cheek rest openly against the gray cotton of my shirt. The quiet relief in her exhale was a sound I cataloged and filed away. It felt like a sudden silence dropping over a loud room. Inside the estate's ground floor office, I set her down on the leather sofa. The room smelled of old paper and lemon polish. I knelt on the rug, untying her shoe with methodical precision. It's just a sprain, she said quickly, pulling her knee back a fraction. The swelling indicates a grade 2 inversion sprain, I replied, pressing my thumbs gently along the anterior talofibular ligament. You have compromised mobility, and you have a data leak. She froze. You heard him. I heard the parameters of the threat, I said. I stood up, walking to the wet bar to retrieve a linen towel and ice from the small freezer. He claims to have server receipts and private files. Are the files legitimate? Vivian looked down at her hands. Yes. My father is the face of Gregory Holdings. I am the architect. Marcus found out. He also found out about the medical consultations I charged to the corporate account. She touched her cheek briefly, a defensive gesture. Surgeries. Laser treatments. Trying to fix this. They didn't work. The board will see it as a misuse of funds and evidence of mental instability. I wrapped the ice in the linen towel. I folded the corners perfectly into a square, ensuring the thickness was uniform, before placing it on her elevated ankle. The pigmentation is a capillary malformation. It has no bearing on your cognitive processing or your mathematical yield for the company. She stared at me, her eyes widening slightly, at the clinical flat delivery of my words. You don't have to pretend it's not hideous to make me feel better, Mr. Griffin. Wyatt, I corrected. And I do not pretend. I deal in observable reality. The reality is that Marcus has unauthorized access to Tier 3 data. That is my domain. I pulled my encrypted tablet from my back pocket and placed it on the coffee table. I aligned the edges of the tablet perfectly parallel with the edge of the wood. I was hired to find the holes in your system. I just found one. We have 6 weeks until the quarterly board vote. I will lock him out, and I will find out how he got in. Vivian watched my hands as I adjusted the tablet 1 more millimeter. Why are you helping me? Your contract is with the board. Marcus is on the board. My contract is to secure the perimeter, I said, looking up at her. He is inside the perimeter. Therefore, he is the target. The next few days were defined by the hum of server racks and the smell of stale coffee. I established a localized sandbox network in the basement office to trap the data packets Marcus was utilizing. Vivian joined me every evening after the standard corporate hours ended. She refused to use crutches, opting for a rigid walking boot that made a heavy rhythmic thud against the floorboards. On Thursday night, the rain started. It hammered against the high basement windows, a chaotic static noise that normally would have irritated me. But inside the room, the atmosphere was contained. Vivian sat at the opposite end of the long oak table, surrounded by a chaotic spray of financial reports, highlighters, and legal pads. It was a disaster of organization. I stopped typing on my terminal and looked at her mess. My chest tightened slightly, the familiar itch of my need for order flaring up. I stood walking over to her side of the table. I didn't speak. I simply began stacking her legal pads, aligning the corners. I capped the highlighters and placed them parallel to the spine of the notebooks. Vivian stopped writing and watched my hands. Does my chaos bother you? Chaos is inefficiency, I said quietly. I arranged her coffee cup so the handle rested at exactly 3 o'clock. I am optimizing your workspace. She let out a soft, breathy laugh. It was the first time I had heard her laugh. It lacked the polished, artificial tone of the executives upstairs. It was real. Thank you, Wyatt. I took a slow breath, feeling a sudden, illogical tightening in my throat. I looked at the port wine stain under the harsh fluorescent light. It wasn't ugly. It was a unique topography. I had to force my hands to stay at my sides. The urge to trace the edge of the pigmentation to understand the temperature of the skin, and there was a deviation from my protocol. I stepped back, putting physical distance between us. Your workflow should improve by 12%. Wyatt, she said, her voice dropping the playful tone. She looked down at the newly organized files. Marcus isn't bluffing. He knows the server architecture better than I do. He helped build the legacy system. Legacy systems have static vulnerabilities, I replied, returning to my screen. Then the phone came off the desk, flipped face down, and slid out of reach. A deliberate signal. You have my full attention. Explain his access level during the build. For the next 3 hours, the threat stayed unspoken. Code architecture and structural logic took its place. Across the glow of the monitors, Vivian mapped the complex data streams without hesitation, tracing hidden dependencies faster than my terminal could surface them. The absolute brilliance of her logic locked a new profound weight into place inside my chest. She wasn't a damsel. She was an architect whose bridge was being bombed by a vandal. The next afternoon, I proved it to the rest of the building with something less elegant than code and more persuasive than opinion. Marcus had used a vendor maintenance window to clone an old service credential from the freight elevator terminal. I found the discrepancy by cross-referencing 3 systems. No one else had bothered to reconcile the parking garage plate reader, the catering invoices from the retreat kitchen, and the elevator controller's dormant audit log. The timestamps lined up only once. Marcus's town car had exited the underground garage 12 minutes after he had officially signed out, and a kitchen runner had billed an after-hours coffee service to Conference Suite B at the exact moment the legacy server room showed a ghost credential waking up. I printed the chain in hard copy, every page numbered, stapled, and backed by the camera stills. Then I walked the packet to compliance, instead of emailing it into a void. Vivian came with me, the walking boot thudding in a slow, determined rhythm beside mine. The compliance director, a narrow-eyed attorney named Elise Warren, flipped through the pages while Marcus's assistant hovered in the doorway, trying to look uninvolved. "You're saying a board officer used a dead maintenance credential to create deniability," Elise said. "I'm saying the freight elevator camera caught the coffee tray. The invoice proves the room was occupied, and the controller log proves the credential woke up from Marcus Thorne's assigned access tree." I answered. "If you suspend the credential now, the next attempt will force him to use a live key. Live keys leave cleaner fingerprints." Elise studied me for a long second, then looked at Vivian. "Did you know any of this?" Vivian's straightened shoulders squared despite the boot. "I knew the system was old," she said. "Wyatt showed me exactly where Marcus was hiding inside it." That answer shifted the room. It wasn't gratitude dressed up as weakness. It was respect stated plainly. Elise signed the temporary suspension order on the spot. Marcus lost one quiet lane into the building, and for the first time, the legal side of Gregory Holdings was moving on our timeline instead of his. By the 3rd week, the tension in the building had shifted from a simmer to a rolling boil. Marcus was growing impatient. He started dropping hints in the public Slack channels, subtle references to ghosts in the machine and medical liabilities. We were in the main lobby when it happened. I was recalibrating the biometric scanners at the front desk while Vivian reviewed a supply manifest with the head of logistics. Marcus walked through the glass doors flanked by 2 junior partners. "Vivian." Marcus called out, his voice carrying across the marble floor. "I see you're still limping. I imagine it's exhausting carrying the weight of the whole company while trying to fix things that can't be fixed." He gestured vaguely toward his own cheek, a clear, cruel reference to her face. The logistics manager looked away, suddenly uncomfortable. Several employees at the coffee kiosk went silent. I did not raise my voice. I did not drop my tools. I finished tightening the torque screw on the scanner, placed the driver on the counter, and turned around. "Mr. Thorne," I said, my voice cutting through the large room with flat acoustic precision. "Your security clearance for this zone expired at 0800 hours. You are currently in violation of the physical perimeter." Marcus scoffed, stepping closer. "I'm a VP. I go where I want." "According to the updated bylaws you signed last quarter, Section 4, Paragraph B, all board members lacking active daily operational codes must be escorted in Sector 1. I cited stepping between him and Vivian. I didn't look at Vivian. I kept my focus locked on his collarbone. "I am controlling the information flow of this sector. You are a disruption. You will exit, or I will log a Level 2 security breach under your name." "You work for me," he hissed, dropping the volume so only the 3 of us could hear. "I work for the integrity of the system," I replied. "And you are a bug. Exit." Marcus looked at the guards, who were now watching closely. He knew the optics of a physical removal would ruin his own polished image. He adjusted his tie, shot a venomous look at Vivian, and walked out. I turned back to the scanner. Biometrics are online. I told the logistics manager, dismissing the tension entirely. Later that night, the midpoint twist hit us like a physical blow. We were in the basement lab. The clock on my terminal read 2:14 a.m. The sandbox network I had built suddenly spiked with traffic. A high-pitched alarm chirped from my secondary monitor. "What is that?" Vivian asked, sitting up straight, her walking boot thumping against the floor. "Packet loss," I said, my fingers flying across the keyboard, executing a hard lockout protocol. "He's not waiting for the board meeting. He just initiated an automated dump. He's leaking a partial file to the internal company server." "Which file?" she asked, her voice tight. I isolated the payload and opened the metadata. My jaw locked. It's a medical receipt from the dermatology clinic in Zurich. Vivian closed her eyes. Her hands resting on the table began to shake. "He did it. Everyone in the company is going to see it when they log in tomorrow morning. They're going to know how much company money I wasted trying to scrub my own face off." "No," I said, my voice sharp. I executed a terminal command bypassing the network switch. I just severed the hard line to the internal server. The packet was caught in the sandbox. It didn't reach the employee portal. I turned my chair to look at her. The shaking hadn't stopped. The external threat had been paused, but the internal damage was tearing through her. She looked smaller, retreating into the asymmetry that I hated seeing her use. I stood up and crossed the room. I didn't offer empty platitudes. I didn't tell her it was going to be okay. I pulled up a chair and sat directly facing her. I reached out and took both of her shaking hands in mine. The contact was functional. It was the principle of the stabilizer. I kept my grip firm, applying steady, even pressure over her knuckles. I didn't stroke her skin or try to pull her into a romantic embrace. I simply provided a physical anchor, a grounding wire for her panic. I focused my own steady heart rate, letting the silence in the room expand until it blocked out the noise of the servers and the storm outside. "Breathe," I instructed quietly. She took a jagged breath, looking down at our joined hands. "My father hid me." She whispered the confession, spilling out without filter. "When I was a teenager, we had a press event. The photographers asked him who the girl with the bruise was. After that, he told me I was better suited for the back office. He made me feel like an error in his perfect ledger. Marcus knows that. He knows this leak will prove to the board that I'm too unstable, too obsessed with my own flaws to lead. You are not an error," I said, my voice dropping to a low, absolute register. I didn't let go of her hands. "You are the foundation of this company. The math proves it. The architecture proves it. I do not care about the optics of your father's ledger. I care about the structural truth. And the truth is, you are the strongest asset in this building." She looked up at me. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, but the shaking in her hands had stopped. The transfer of stability was complete. "He's going to try again," she said. "Let him," I replied, finally releasing her hands and standing up. I felt the loss of contact as a cold void in my palms, but I ignored it. Yearning was a luxury. Discipline was the requirement. He triggered the sandbox. I now have his MAC address and his physical location logs. We have the evidence. The second obstacle arrived 2 days later, not as a digital attack, but as a bureaucratic maneuver. I received an encrypted email from my contracting agency. Marcus had filed a formal conflict of interest complaint against me, citing inappropriate proximity to the CEO's daughter. He was demanding my removal from the premises before the emergency board meeting he had called for Friday. I stood in the empty hallway outside Vivian's office, reading the email on my phone. The class divide was a sharp, jagged reality. I was a hired technician, an ex-military contractor, who wore gray t-shirts and carried a tool bag. She was the heiress to a billion-dollar holding company. Marcus was weaponizing my lower status to isolate her. If I fought the agency, I risked my license. If I left, she faced the board alone. I didn't hesitate. I drafted a one-sentence reply to my agency. Effective immediately, I am terminating my employment with the firm and operating as an independent entity. I hit send. I gave up the safety of my career umbrella to remain on the board. It was a calculated sacrifice. Friday morning arrived with the sterile, high-stakes atmosphere of an execution. The boardroom on the 50th floor was encased in glass, overlooking the gray expanse of the city. The 12 board members sat around the long oak table. Vivian's father, the CEO, sat at the head looking weary and detached. Marcus stood at the projector, exuding polished confidence. Vivian sat near the center. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer. Her hair was pulled back tightly, exposing the entirety of her face, including the port wine stain. It was a visible choice. She was refusing to hide. I stood by the heavy wooden doors at the back of the room, my arms crossed. I was technically no longer employed by the agency, but I had retained my physical access badge. As you can see, Marcus addressed the room, projecting a slide that showed a vague, out-of-context financial graph. The structural integrity of Gregory Holdings is at risk. We have a shadow leadership problem. Vivian has been making unilateral decisions, expensing personal medical liabilities, and compromising our data security. I have the files to prove it. He reached for his laptop to initiate the data dump. Vivian stood up. She didn't look at her father. She looked directly at the board. Marcus is correct about one thing. She said, her voice clear and commanding. There is a data security problem. But it is not mine. She reached into her blazer and produced a thick, perfectly aligned stack of paper. She tossed it onto the center of the oak table. These are the server access logs from the past 6 weeks. They detail unauthorized packet transfers from the legacy system to an external drive. The MAC address matches the laptop currently sitting in front of Marcus Thorne. The room murmured. Marcus stiffened. This is fabricated nonsense. She's desperate. I stepped forward from the doors. The room went dead silent. I walked to the edge of the table. I did not raise my voice, but the acoustic command in my tone was absolute. I am the independent security auditor for this facility. I stated, placing a sealed USB drive on the table next to Vivian's documents. I established a localized sandbox network to monitor unauthorized exfiltration. At 2:14 a.m. on Wednesday, the device registered to Mr. Thorne attempted to deploy a ransomware-style leak of private employee data to the internal network. I intercepted the payload. The cryptographic signatures are ironclad. The chain of custody has been verified by a third-party legal notary. Marcus looked at the USB drive, his face draining of color. He's lying. He works for her. I work for the truth, I said simply. And the truth is, you violated the Federal Wiretap Act corporate espionage statutes and your own non-compete clause. The authorities have already been provided a copy of this drive. They are currently waiting in the lobby downstairs. The CEO stood up, his face grim. He looked at Marcus, then at the documents, and finally at his daughter. For the first time, there was respect in his eyes, not pity. Marcus, pack your office. You're done. The aftermath was a swift, brutal corporate cleansing. Marcus was escorted out. The board, terrified of the legal implications of the leak, unanimously voted to officially recognize Vivian's role as Chief Operating Officer, bringing her out of the shadows. An hour later, The boardroom was empty. The city lights were beginning to flicker on outside the glass walls. I was packing up my diagnostic tablet, aligning the cables in my bag with meticulous care. My job here was done. I had severed my agency ties. I was unemployed, but the perimeter was secure. I zipped the bag and turned around. Vivian was standing in the doorway. She had taken off her blazer, leaving her in a simple white blouse. She walked toward me, the heavy boot on her right foot, gone replaced by a slight, manageable limp. "The board wants to retain you," she said quietly. "As the in-house director of security, direct report to me." I looked at her. I kept my hands at my sides, fighting the gravity that pulled me toward her. "I am an independent contractor. I require strict parameters." "I know," she said. She reached out her fingers, lightly touching the gray cotton of my shirt, right over my chest. It was a clear public acknowledgement in a room made of glass. Anyone outside could see us. She was choosing me. "I want you to stay, Wyatt. Not to fix my network. To stay with me." The rigid protocols I had maintained for 6 weeks finally splintered. No speech followed. No poetic declaration. Closing the remaining distance, I lifted my right hand and gently cupped the side of her face, the side with the port wine stain. The skin was warm. It was perfect. I leaned down and kissed her. It was not a frantic, messy collision. It was the principle of the arrival. It felt like dropping an anchor in a harbor after months at sea. It was a heavy grounding absolute, a promise sealed without words. When I pulled back slightly, her eyes were closed, a look of profound peace on her face. "I'm staying," I murmured, my thumb brushing her cheekbone. I learned that true safety isn't found in hiding your flaws, but in standing beside someone who treats them as irrelevant. Real love isn't about dramatic rescue. It's about consistency, respect, and showing up every day to build a secure perimeter together. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.